All right, everybody. Welcome to special Friday evening stream with Real Crusades history. And Rand just jumped in, so I'm going to add him. Hey, Rand, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're actually live already. So
I figured. I apologize for all the technical difficulties.
no, it's fine. I wouldn't say we had too many technical difficulties. Just getting the link to your email was
Right.
maybe a little bit of a thing, but that's okay. We're here and we're ready to go. And
Well, neither one of us are old enough for people to accuse us of boomering anything up. So
yeah, I don't think the boomer tech excuse is going to work for us for sure. But hey, that's okay. So how's it going?
it's going, man. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be back and looking forward to it.
No, I'm glad that we're doing this. I think this is kind of getting back to our roots of streaming. Kind of the epic Friday evening stream, just talking all things Crusades history. So glad we're here. I am going to just to start things off, give the plug for Knights of the Cross. Guys, go to knightsofthecross.com. You can watch episode 1 there. And also, you can look into helping us fund episode 2. So that is up on the screen right now.
I do have to say, I've watched a decent amount of it, just out of personal interest, and with the resources that were available, I have to say that was a very impressive production. That was way more than I would have thought. Could have been done with something of that scale.
Yeah.
So that it was really well done.
I was impressed too with the
I would just say well done to you and well done to the team, and it surpassed expectations. I'll put it that way.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you feel that way, Rand, and I think we're pleased with it, and we just kind of want to keep building from there, and increase the budgets over time and keep making better and better productions. So.
It really is, I would say from a pop culture standpoint, there is just such an untapped gold mine waiting to be had in just historical dramas in general, and I would say specifically medieval historical dramas.
Yeah,
there is just so much potential there for something that could. I mean, you look at things like Game of Thrones or even the most recent like House of the Dragon kind of thing, and you see how popular they are, and then you think, what could you do with the real history? Because there's even more drama and suspense and
characters
and characters, and it's just there's so much more there that and it's all things that actually happened. It's all people who actually existed, and there's just so much. There's so much untapped potential there, and I think it's things like Knights of the Cross and whatnot are just gonna. They're gonna whet people's appetite for something that they didn't even know that they wanted, but they do.
I agree. So cool. So yeah, everybody check out Knights of the Cross, and Rand and I are going to get into it. Glad to have everybody here. And I'm just going to say hi to some people in the chat here. We've got let's see who's here. My scrolly thing to work here. We've got Tom is here, which is good. And we've got Jonah and Berzelmeyer and Tom Jensen, and Chris is here. And Chris is can you see the questions okay? Brand?
I can see. No, I can't see it on the StreamYard side, but I can see it on the YouTube side. So
okay, cool. Well, that works. Well, let's kick it off with Chris's first question here, which is, do you think Philip II of France deserves the title Augustus? And I'm going to give a hard no to that. He deserves the title Worm, which is what I call him. I call him Philip the Worm. So, and I'll turn that over to you, Rand. What do you think about that one?
You know, it's one of those situations of it reminds me of Winston Churchill's rather infamous quote of people love to quote him like this is a good thing that he said, and I would 100% disagree. But he very infamously said that the history shall be kind to me because I intend to write it. And it unfortunately it speaks to a kind of an eternal truth of human history, and that is that unfortunately most of the time the winners do actually get to write the history books, rather unfairly, and you see a lot of that. As I understand, Philippe de France was not even called Augustus until after he was dead, I believe.
I'm not sure about that.
I don't think he was ever called that in his lifetime. And it's one of those things where, especially the kings of France, I mean, they really did think of themselves clear into the early modern period. They thought of themselves as the premier sovereigns of Europe. They were the they were the kings of the eldest daughter of Christendom and all that, and they cultivated this cult of Charlemagne that they very religiously adhered to, especially in the aftermath of Saint King Louis IX, and it. I think there's several figures in French royal history you could say that probably kind of went to their head a little bit. And Philippe II, when you actually look at what he did in his life, while domestically maybe it was impressive, he was able to unite by the end of his life, by the end of his reign, he was able to largely unite a realm that had once been at the beginning of his reign, almost 2/3 of it was owned by the kings of England.
Well, see, that's the thing. Like, I don't really acknowledge it as a single realm. I think that was kind of a creation of. It was an accident of history because Richard the Lionheart died young.
It was very much, and it really wasn't until his great grandson, Louis IX. Grandson or great grandson? I think it was great grandson. I might be getting my generations wrong, but it really wasn't until Louis IX that the idea of France as a single united realm came about. And then on top of that, even after Louis IX, then you had the 100 Years' War, which really.
Let's not stay too long on this question because we want to get.
Yeah, it's just so did he?
Your answer is no, right?
Yeah. Did he deserve the title of Augustus? I would say in his life, no.
Okay, perfect.
Not at all.
All right, so let's go. Tom's got one here. Along with being admired, respected, do you think veteran crusaders were also feared to a certain degree by ordinary knights and soldiers when they returned to Europe? Interesting question there. I'll let you start with that one, Rand.
That's a very particular question, and I think it's way more suited to the individual. I think the most honest answer that I could give is I honestly don't know. Was he respected? Absolutely.
I think they were more respected. I have a hard time. I mean, maybe by their enemies. Like Philip II feared Richard. To get back to that.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely, there was a certain aura to men who had fought in the East and had come back. One of the greatest examples, it's actually what I'm currently reading about right now. I'm reading a great book about the Welsh Wars of Edward I, And one part of what made Edward Longshanks such a kind of a revered and odd figure in his time was the reputation that he was one of the last preeminent lords of Europe, of Christendom, who went and fought in the East, and lived to tell about it. And he brought a lot of experience back from that, from that period of his life. And even in his own home turf of the British Isles, that was kind of one of the things that kind of awed people about him, was the fact that he had been to the East and he had come back, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, there was definitely an aura that surrounded those kinds of guys. But yeah, to say that they were feared, I don't know. That might be a little bit too far.
And then Tom has another question here. What happened to Godfrey's other brother Eustace after the First Crusade was over? Well, he was the Count of Bologna, and he just went back to being Count of Bologna. He returned home.
Yeah.
So, which was one of the most prestigious and important princes of, the French-speaking parts of Latin Christendom. So
it was, and it also lied in kind of one of those regions where the lines that separated France from the German Holy Roman Empire were kind of blurred a little bit. And
yeah, was he a dual vassal? Like, did he?
He actually was. Yeah, the Counts of Boulogne at the time were considered dual vassals between the kings of France and
the
Holy Roman Empire, which really put them in kind of the ideal position, because it meant that they could always kind of leverage one against the other. And for the most part, it basically meant that they were functionally autonomous in a lot of ways. So that was a very. It's really no surprise that as the elder brother, that Eustace went back to his patrimony, because that was a very sweet gig. As it were.
I mean, he was, of the three brothers, he was not intending to stay. Godfrey and Baldwin both intended to stay, and they did, obviously. But yeah, Eustace, he was intending to go back.
It would be a fantastic. And their father, the elder Eustace,
Eustace the second, or Eustace. I don't know if I'm saying Eustace or Eustace. I'm not sure. Yeah,
their father actually fought alongside William the Conqueror at Hastings.
Yep.
Was one of his he was one of the Flemish adventurers who joined the Norman conquest campaign in 1066.
He even appears in the Bayeux Tapestry.
Like, he does.
Like they believe that he is the one who is pointing to William.
Yep.
When he's pulling his helmet up.
Yep.
Because he's got the mustache that was in fashion for that region at the time, which is kind of interesting. I always like that picture of him in the Bayeux Tapestry.
Great. Having gotten to see the Bayeux Tapestry in person several times, it's a great scene in it. And you can, and even though it's woven into a tapestry, you can really sense that, you can feel the drama of that scene and the gravitas of it. It's a great scene.
And let's see here. Dan asks, where can I find episode 1 or even the trailer? The answer to that is knightsofthecross.com. Just go there, and as you can see here on the screen, it's linked there, and you can find all the information about supporting the show. So that's all there. If you guys want to check out the first episode, or you can go to my YouTube channel. It's on the close to the front page there too. And then Tanner asks, why do so many historians and others who are well informed talk about the politics of the Crusades and always downplay the spiritual and piety of some of the fighters on both sides? That's a good question. And I know what you're talking about. There's kind of a tendency in present day history among present day historians. They're getting away from it to some extent, but to make it more about like cynical motivations, like somehow that's more realistic. like, oh, well, if we just reduce everything to power politics, that's more realistic. But really, that's kind of an error in thinking, because you have to get at the truth isn't necessarily the most cynical, or how it's perceived, or
Right.
what would be perceived to be the most cynical. You're not somehow being more real just because you focus on that. The reality is the spiritual aspect was just as important.
Absolutely. And actually, this is a major criticism that even just I personally have against the, I guess, dare I say, the more current day traditional attitude towards just history in general, especially pre-modern history, is that modern historians have this very bad habit. Although, like you said, it is getting better. But modern historians in general, for the vast majority of the last 100 years, have this extremely bad habit of looking at everything through modern lenses. And that means secular, cynical, materialist. They don't appreciate the fact that so many. There it is. Yeah, that's a great scene.
I'd love that image. I wanted to find it while you were answering, but
Yeah.
it is awesome, isn't it?
But yeah, I tell people all the time, as somebody who specializes in the medieval period with my own particular academic interest with military history. I tell people all the time that you will not understand the medieval period in general at all if you approach it with modern sensibilities, because they weren't like us in so many different ways. These were extremely. I actually got into a. It's funny. I don't know if anybody here listening knows about the channel Kings and Generals, but I actually got into a rather
Robust.
no, not robust. It was civil.
Spirited.
I got into a very civil debate with one of their chief writers over there, because on one of their sub channels, which is it's where they're doing a kind of an alternate history series of if the Mongols had invaded Western Europe.
Yeah, I saw that.
The biggest problem that I had with it was what they depicted happening to Roman Catholicism. And it was very much written by somebody with a very secular understanding of how not just Latin Catholicism, but also just religion in general at that time period worked. And it was kind of this very cynical, if XYZ happened, then this religion would just collapse. And I'm like, okay, well, first off, that's in terms of, as speaking as a practicing Roman Catholic, that's not even how that would have worked even back then. Two, it seems to fly in the face of all the evidence that we have of these people of when adversity approached these people, they didn't become less religious, they became even more religious. They became, their spirituality heightened in times of crisis. And
also, real quick rant, I know the video you're talking about. I think they kind of almost like said stuff like, "Oh well, the Poles would have joined them and helped them invade Hungary." I don't quote me on that, but it was they were proposing alliances that I thought were just very unlikely.
I would agree. I would very much agree that I'll put it this way. I as somebody who has studied the history of the period on a semi-professional basis, I was not impressed with their interpretation of what would have gone down, because it flew in the face of way too much evidence that we actually do have from the period. But I would say of all the criticisms, the greatest one, and it's the one that you see way too many times in postmodern historiography. Like I said, and like you've said, it is getting better. It is genuinely getting better. But for way too long, there has just been this attitude of rank secular cynicism that just it doesn't fit with the period, and it doesn't fit with the values that the people of those times held from cradle to grave. And to if you are going to write, to go back to Tanner's question here, if you are going to write a history of that period, you have to understand religion and spirituality in the way that they would have in their time, because you cannot approach it with modern sensibilities, because with modern with postmodern secular sensibilities, it will not work, it will not fit, and you will ultimately be off the mark.
All right, so let's check out some other questions here. Tom says, any surviving firsthand accounts of the First Crusaders' arrival home to Europe? Not really, not that I
Firsthand accounts.
Because all the firsthand accounts were done by people who stayed.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I know, like Fulker of Chartres, he stayed.
Yeah.
In terms of the ones we have, which
right.
That's it's amazing. We have so few compared to like what we would have now, and it's in this situation like that. Like we don't have a lot of like just very personal things people wrote. We have
we don't. I would say the closest you can probably get, the one that comes immediately to mind would be, it's not the First Crusade, it's actually the Third Crusade, but is Amboise. Amboise's chronicle that he wrote about Richard I, and his campaigns on the Third Crusade. He actually did come back. And Amboise actually has some very poignant, granted, he didn't really write so much a chronicle as he wrote more sort of like an epic poem. And he has some extremely very poignant lines. It's actually, speaking of, since we're rapidly approaching this holiday this weekend, it's actually my favorite Memorial Day quote, because it's the quote of, it's the stanza of his that reads something along the lines of those of us who went to Jerusalem and who came back and who lost the ones along the way, and talking about how they were the ones that found the New Jerusalem,
Yeah.
And it's just
I do love that quote.
It's just really beautiful. Like
those of us who were there, we understood, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And
like we
people who criticized what we did, they
we were there, we saw it, we did it, and we lost people along the way, and it's it really is just this beautiful quote, and it's I think that more than anything probably sums up the mentality of the Crusaders that went to the East and survived and came back. And they probably carried that with them for the rest of their lives. In fact, I could guarantee that they did, because the ones that we have funerary effigies of on their tombs, their legs are crossed. So and as long as those sculptures survive, that legacy survives.
Yeah, and it definitely remained a part of your identity from then on. I mean, like we have, of course, Robert of Flanders was known as Robert of Jerusalem, for the rest of his life, which is kind of amazing. So yeah, that's a powerful thing to think about, is the spirit of crusading and how it impacted. I mean, it impacted all of Latin Christendom. I mean, this was like the subject of all the songs of this. This was the touchstone moment.
It was
period, and it's something that in a lot of ways it did. And this actually kind of leads into Rob's question here. Do you think that the Crusaders, or at least the First Crusade, contribute in any way to the eventual uniting of France? And I don't think, and I want to kind of emphasize this, not in political terms, because that's not what was important about the Crusades. The Crusades transcended the petty political divisions across Latin Christendom. And that's actually what's important about them, is that they created this common experience and common identity in some ways across Latin Christendom that was shared by all these different people who, they already shared their religion. I mean, they were Latin Christian, they were
Mhm.
Catholics. In I often say Latin Christians because my head is so much in that period, but in today's terminology, it would be Catholics. But they already had that. But then the crusade was this first common enterprise where you could go from a church, churches from Germany to England to Italy all had commemorations to their crusaders.
Mhm.
So that's kind of interesting.
It really did. It wasn't. We didn't. You're talking about a time in Christendom when spiritual identity meant far more than political identity, or even what we would understand in
Hmm.
modern terms is like national identity. There really weren't any nation states back then, like in the way that we understand them now,
Hmm.
or that
Right.
we've understood them in the modern period. Um, the idea of all of Christendom uniting and going off to the east, on this grand chivalric adventure slash pilgrimage. That was it really was the societal ideal. And when you look at the actual numbers of the people who actually did it, who actually put their money where their mouth was and actually did it, it was the minority.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think they always carried kind of a fraternity, a brotherhood with each other, the ones that came back. No matter where they went, no matter what lord they served, no matter what their allegiances were, back when they got back home, there was always that idea of, we both took the cross together, and we were both out in the east together. you know um and you see that all over the place. You see that all over medieval history, that sort of ideal. And
I
it
like this.
and you even see it long after the Crusades ceased to really be a phenomenon. Even in the later medieval period, you still see that. You still see that sort of ideal being held up. Granted, it was becoming, much less. It was rapidly, kind of becoming less and less important in terms of practical power. But the ideal was still there, even late into the 15th century.
Yeah, this image on the screen right now is Gustave Doré, the famous French woodcutter who did this image. This is supposed to be troubadours singing about the Crusades, and obviously this is kind of an idealized 19th century type image, but it captures the culture of crusade. I guess you could call it crusading culture. How I mean, it was not just about the people who went to the war. It was something that
Yeah,
was shared by the whole society, and this is women and children
yeah,
listening to these guys sing about the Crusades, which would have been absolutely a universal type experience that would have been, throughout Latin Christendom. I mean, this
yeah.
was
Well,
in
and many of them would have been personally invested in it.
yeah.
It was their sons, it was their husbands, it was their fathers, it was their brothers, that went off and did it.
And here's
And
another really good image that I think kind of captures that by the same
oh yeah,
artist.
well God,
I've always loved this one because you've got there's the knight, there's their children, and then one of the sons I think even kind of has his hand on the shield, and there's the lady, the knight's wife, and she's presenting the sword to the Virgin Mary with Christ, and this is, I don't know, this is just such a powerful image that for me is a definitive image from Gustave Doré, sort of
yeah,
articulating the Crusades
yeah.
visually.
Well, and while granted, Doré very much lived in the height of what we might call the Romanticist era, but in a lot of ways, he very accurately captured it, in a very dramatic and romantic fashion. He very much captured the sentiments of the era.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is a scene that isn't very far removed from what would have actually happened. And the people who did that would have actually believed that. You know, again, to kind of throw it back to the cynical modernist. You know, it's like, no, they actually believed that religion was a very real, tangible thing to them. And it wasn't just this thing that you did when it was convenient, or because it gave you power, or because you know, anything like that. They actually, there was a raw physicality to the medieval spirituality. And they believed it. They actually believed it, and they structured their entire societies around it.
And let's see here. Tom says, throughout the First Crusade and immediately following its end, did the Crusaders ever build any monuments in any of the cities they conquered to commemorate the victory? And yeah, I mean,
The Holy Sepulchre.
yeah. I mean, churches everywhere they went. You know, and even a castle. If you took a fortress, you would put a church there, or a chapel, or something like that. I mean, definitely.
The entire Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Old Jerusalem is of it's of the Normans. The architecture is very much in the Norman style, and it's you know, it's very much influenced by the architectural, the sort of neo-Romanesque architectural styles, the Norman, the vastly Norman Crusaders who built it and who dwelled in the Frankish Crusader state of Jerusalem brought. In fact, I think it was Queen Melisande who commissioned the current Church of the Holy Sepulchre that's there in the 1130s, and you can very much see that architectural influence there. It's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful church.
It's my favorite church in the world, personally.
Yeah, it really is. I've obviously
want to go back.
Oh yeah, well, and I, of course, anybody who's ever been to St. Peter's in Rome, is obviously very impressed, and with all the basilicas in Rome and whatnot. But there is something about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that is very, very special and unique, and you don't find anything like it really anywhere else. But yeah, I mean, that entire church was a monument to it's the part of Jerusalem that I really liked being in, because it's the last standing remnant of Crusader Jerusalem. It's still there with all the countless crosses etched into the walls.
Yeah, I love those crosses
of all the Crusaders that that had ever been there, all the Crusaders and pilgrims that had ever come there. There really is just something. There's something there that's unlike any other church that's anywhere else.
And Tom wants to know what ended up happening to Peter the Hermit, and I will admit I don't remember. To look it up, I guess.
I know he went back. I know he was associated with the Crusade of 11.
Was he? Okay.
Yeah, he was involved with that, which is it's again is kind of ironic that that crusade ended as badly as it did, and he was involved in it. It's kind of like that guy destroyed everything he touched.
Looks like there's a couple of different dates for his death. Like Albert of Aachen says he died in 1131 at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or no, as in a church he founded in France. I guess he went back apparently, or some people think he did. And then there's another monastery that claims he died in 1115. So I guess there's kind of some. It sounds like he went back though.
Yeah, and it's highly possible. He's one of those guys that I would definitely say he's one of those more problematic figures of the history of the Crusades, because he's just he seems to be involved with so many things that go badly, yeah, it's probably interesting, and he did seem to be able to get around very well, which is another thing that maybe kind of makes you look at him sideways, a little bit of, you seem to bounce back a little too quickly, from failure, kind of thing. But hey, but you know, maybe we can also give him the benefit of the doubt, and maybe he was just a very, very driven guy who just had really bad luck. I don't know. But
And Chris wants to know if there were any major criticisms of the idea of crusading at the time of medieval Europe.
absolutely.
So yeah, there was
In fact,
some.
there were some harsh criticisms even at the time of the First Crusade. There were some factions of churchmen, and clerics, especially within the church, who were very uneasy at the idea of granting indulgences for what essentially amounted to acts of warfare. By the time the papacy threw its weight behind it, those criticisms kind of fell by the wayside. But there were criticisms, and very vocal criticisms, especially near the beginning, from various churchmen who just they took a different interpretation of what was allowed within the context of spiritually sanctioned warfare. So it wasn't a unanimous concept, even at its beginning. But by the time the popes got involved, and they looked at it, I would say it pretty definitively was decided that this is in line with with Orthodox Catholic doctrine as we understand it, and that there isn't as much of a contradiction as maybe some might be tempted to see on its surface, and that still rings true to this day, despite any more politically motivated mouthings of contemporary clergy. The idea of a just cause for conflict is still very much with us, even to this day.
Mm-hmm. And let's see. And then Chris has another one. Have we read any letters of Catherine of Siena?
A long time ago.
And yeah, he mentions that she dictated some letters calling on people to crusade, which, yeah, that's something I remember being really fascinated to find that in some of her writings. She basically would tell people, you need to stop fighting your fellow Christians. You need to be over in the Holy Land fighting, against the Saracens. Which, again, it's kind of an intriguing thing to me how much of the Crusades were such a big deal for so many centuries, and how, like a lot of Catholics today know about St. Catherine of Siena, but they don't know that. They don't know that Joan of Arc talked about the Crusades. I mean, it's just kind of a somewhat overlooked aspect of a lot of the lives of these important saints. Even
there's actually a lot of contemporary saints in Latin Catholicism that are I would argue are woefully misunderstood in modern times. One of the greatest examples that stands out to me is St. Francis of Assisi, who's so often depicted, even by the religious order that he founded to this day, is so often depicted as, oh, he was a pacifist. He was, almost sort of like he was like a neo hippie, and he threw his medals over the wall, and all this kind of thing. And it's like, in real life, you actually read his biography and you find out that not only did he not fight, he actually fought several times. He actually was he was looking at being a sort of a career soldier in Italy, and it wasn't until that he was he was in a battle where he was captured, and he spent time in captivity as a essentially what we would think of as a POW today, that he had his conversion experience. And even after he had his religious awakening and he founded the Franciscan order, a lot of people make a big deal about, he went on the Fifth Crusade. He joined the Fifth Crusade to go like stop the fighting and to solve it all peacefully. That's not at all what he did. He actually went over to the Fifth Crusade to support the Fifth Crusade, and his attempt at trying to convert the Sultan of Egypt was not so much out of a desire for pacifism. It was out of a desire for Christendom to win, via evangelization. There was not he was a very militant. You actually read Francis of Assisi's actual writings that he wrote, during his lifetime. He was a very militant figure. You could tell the soldier never really left him in his life. And it's so embarrassing now that he's so misrepresented, in modern times. Is always, he loved animals and he was like this, hippie. It was like, it's like, no, that's not, I mean, he loved animals, but but in the way that, like some, ex-combat veteran loves animals, it's, that's not who he was. And I think even with St. Catherine of Siena, she was, you could almost argue she was kind of the pest of 14th century Italian politics. Like there was no conflict or controversy or anything that was going on in 14th century Italy in her time that she did not directly involve herself in. And she was very belligerent about it. And so much so that like even popes at the time we have writings from popes at the time who like talk about her in terms of like this gadfly, that like just like, just constantly barging her way in and constantly, pushing them to do the, what she believed was the right thing. And causing all sorts of controversy wherever she went. But actually what Chris is referring to specifically, she actually met in person one of the more infamous mercenary free company leaders in 14th century Italy at that time. He was an Englishman. He was a veteran of the 100 Years' War. And after the Treaty of Bretigny, he went off to seek his fortune as a sellsword in Italy. His name was Sir John Hawkwood. And if you go to Florence to this day, if you go to the Duomo in Florence, there's a gigantic funerary memorial to Sir John Hawkwood, or Giovanni Acuto, as they knew him in Italy, painted by Paolo Uccello. And he was Florence. The Republic of Florence was his last employer, and that's who when he died, they buried him with full state honors. But she actually met him in person, and essentially told him, you need to stop fighting your fellow Italians. You need to stop fighting your fellow Christians, and you need to go east. And you need to fight the Saracen out east. And while John Hawkwood never actually,
there he is.
Yeah, there he is. That's exactly. If you go to the Duomo, that's what you'll see. While he never actually went east and he never actually stopped fighting his fellow Christians, we do have evidence even from Sir John Hawkwood's own writings that he was extremely impressed by this feisty little Sienese nun, that was bold enough to walk right into his camp full of sellswords and mercenaries and get right up into his business about what he should and should not be doing. So it's, there's all sorts of beautiful little vignettes like that from even just the lives of Catholic saints that just don't get talked about enough, and they're not well known enough, unfortunately.
All right, and Tanner wants to know, Why do you both think the crusade in Iberia was as successful as it was? And well,
Probably
okay,
for the,
I'll throw this out there. I
yeah, I'll
think
let you go. I'll let you go first.
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that you had important kings who had a direct territorial interest involved in it.
Hmm.
And so it kind of, and they were right there and they were always there. And they, as opposed to in the whole, I mean, and the logistics were closer. Like, I mean, they had France right behind them, and the rest of Europe was right there.
Hmm.
And I think logistics plus the fact that you had major powers in Christendom that were just right there, and were directing it.
In many ways, the Iberian, the Reconquista was almost an obverse mere reflection of the Levant in the Near East. Just like I said, it's the obverse. The Christians won in Spain for the same reasons that the Muslims eventually won in the East. It was their home turf, and they had far more resources at hand. They had far greater momentum behind them than the opposite side, which was mostly considered, the foreigner, and the ones who needed extreme amounts of support in order to just keep it going. So I think in a lot of ways, they very, in a weird way, in an opposite sense, they mirrored each other. And I would absolutely argue that Moorish Spain, the existence of Moorish Spain, was a finite phenomenon that was going to have an expiration date with it.
Yeah, I
Now,
mean, I would.
if it took 700 years, you can chalk up to a lot of different things. But I would definitely say that Moorish Spain was not destined to last.
I would maybe question that a little bit. I mean, I tend to think that neither the results of neither were inevitable. I do agree with you that there was momentum involved that helped the sides that ultimately won. But you know, I mean, the Muslims they had North Africa right there, which I do think that the logistics for Muslim Spain were actually easier than for the Christians in the Holy Land. The Christians in the Holy Land really didn't have anything close. They had at a certain point they had Cyprus, but Cyprus
Right,
was never a major power. Whereas
right,
the Maghreb was a major area of Muslim power, and there were major Muslim powers right there that were just kind of a short skip across Gibraltar to you
and
know
maybe that right there is the answer for why it lasted 700 years.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think definitely because it would not have lasted had the Almoravids not gotten involved in
Right,
the 1080s. Like
right,
if that had not happened, then Alfonso VI probably would have been the king who would have completed the Reconquista because
most likely,
yeah,
yeah.
because Moorish Spain was basically on its knees
Yep.
at that moment, and the Berbers showed up and they
It
had
would
this empire and
if the probably the equivalent for the Outremer for the Levant would have been like if there had been this massive resurgence of the Eastern Roman Empire, and if they had become way more
mm,
amenable to Western Christendom, and had been like right there in Syria,
yeah.
you
Or
know,
what if the Byzantine Empire had been a major Catholic empire instead
right, right.
that, that was
That
secure
probably
and
would have been the
stable?
equivalent of
Yeah,
what there was with with Spain. But ultimately, I would say your overall assessment is correct in that, Christendom was right there. They didn't have to go across the sea. There wasn't this massive logistical undertaking that had to go down in order for them to get there. They literally just had to cross the Pyrenees and they were right there.
And a lot of people came down and,
I mean,
all through
Lisbon was liberated by an Anglo-Norman, force. That was
in cooperation with the king,
Right. Didn't even
again,
intend to be there. That they were intending to go. They were intending to go to the Holy Land to be part of the Second Crusade, and
there's some question about that. That's kind of the traditional view, but some historians have. I guess there's some speculation that Bernard of Clairvaux may have himself been negotiating with some of these guys on behalf of the king. I didn't know that until recently. Actually, when I was doing this big documentary about the Second Crusade, I happened to look at some of that, and that was actually kind of a surprise to me too, because I had not heard that. I always
I'd be very interested to see.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that the Iberian kings were taking an interest in the preaching of the Second Crusade pretty early on, and they sent some representatives over. And so I guess the traditional idea is that it was kind of a happenstance thing. They were on their way, and so they stopped off to help. But it does appear more likely that there was some negotiation involved ahead of time to get those guys out there. What's interesting
about that, now that you mentioned that, is that when the Second Crusade actually went underway, well, granted, what obviously got the lion's share of the attention was the effort, to go actually to Outremer. It was actually the first crusade that saw kind of the crusading indulgence expanded to multiple fronts. It was where they expanded it to the Reconquista in Iberia, and it was the first time that it was officially expanded up to in the Baltic. With the Baltic Crusade,
the Wendish Crusade,
So in a lot of ways, the Second Crusade was kind of the first one that was kind of international in character.
Oh, for sure,
multi-front and it was a multiple front crusade, and it the one that went east unfortunately turned into a something rather of a disappointment. But the Baltic Crusade that went down at the same time, and the Iberian efforts that went down at the same time, were actually extremely successful. And they don't get enough attention, unfortunately.
All right, and let's see here.
Mailer Tarshal, is that Taylor Marshall in disguise? Is
which one?
It was right there. Is the Ave Maria? The average crusader? Yeah, that's
okay. So let's see. Rob asks, with the Mongol invasion of the Middle East in 1251, the Mongols ended up converting to Islam, although some considering their conversion to be invalid. I don't think they converted that early. It was quite a bit later, wasn't it?
I think there were members of the Khan of the Chinggisid family that did convert around that time, but it was very much on an individual basis. They were not. Yeah, the Mongols is you don't see like the entire Golden Horde going full Mongol until kind of the late 1200s. Even like early 1300s, and also to include the Ilkhanate as well. Those are the two major ones that went Islamic of the original Mongol conquest when they kind of got broken up. So and you also got to remember that the Mongols had this very kind of laissez-faire attitude when it came to religions. They were very much sort of like, hey, the people that we've conquered, they can kind of just do whatever they want to do, and as long as they pay taxes and they pay tribute and they don't cause any issues and they send men to fight and arm, send men as our auxiliaries for our armies, we really don't care. we're going to do what we're going to do. And what's funny is even the ones that did convert to Islam, there's contemporary writings of Islamic scholars of the time who are constantly condemning them because they're such bad Muslims. They're eating pork and they're getting drunk every night, all this kind of thing. So, even the ones that did convert to Islam, it was kind of like, yeah, okay, but did they really? It's the story of the Mongols and how they treated religions it's a very interesting topic because and it's one that often gets this crazy amount of emphasis from kind of more modernist scholars because they love to hype up, they were so tolerant of other religions and all that. It's like, okay, yeah, they were tolerant of other religions, but they also initiated what is quite possibly the most recent mass extinction event of humanity in recent times. Like they were not the entire genetic landscape of Central Asia still bears the mark of the Mongol conquest. Like let's not get ahead of ourselves here too much on the peace, love, and tolerance front when it comes to them.
And then Berzelmeyer wants to know, did King Richard and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa communicate through letters during the Third Crusade?
Not that I'm aware of. I
don't think so. Because they actually got going at different times too.
True, and if they did, there are those records don't exist.
Because God, I have to look this up now. It's kind of driving me nuts, but didn't Richard actually? He left in the summer of 1190, didn't he?
I want to say it was a little earlier than that, but
to look this up now.
I could be wrong.
I think Barbarossa died in for some reason June 1190 he died.
Okay.
And Richard left. Let's see here. Richard left for the first. I gotta get my speech together.
To our
Third Crusade.
To our audience watching who may be objecting to using Wikipedia, I will say one thing about Wikipedia. It is extremely useful if you are just looking for names, dates, and places.
Yeah, basic stuff like this.
That is a very useful tool if you're just looking for just base like names, dates, and places. It is a very reliable resource.
He set out for Crusade summer of 1190. So I guess so it's like he was leaving right around when Barbarossa died. So that's pretty interesting.
I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that there was some kind of communication between. I mean, you're talking about the preeminent potentates of Western Europe. I strongly doubt that there was absolutely no communication whatsoever between Richard I, Philippe II, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. There was probably even at the very least through intermediaries, there was probably some sort of negotiation because if I recall correctly, Richard was one of the first to take the cross.
Oh yeah, he took it. He took it before all those guys.
Yeah. So, I am sure that there was some kind of mutual communication going on. Granted, it was probably very sporadic. Due to even just the limitations of the time, that it wasn't very frequent. But no, I'm sure there was some sort of contact between them in some way, shape, or form. It's just Frederick would have seen himself as an emperor, and he probably would have seen himself as the preeminent potentate of Western Europe. Even outranking Philip II and Richard I. and was probably pretty much on his own program as far as his crusade was concerned, and his attitude was everybody else could deal with it. And really is just because of just unbelievably bad luck that he didn't show up in the Holy Land himself with his allegedly 200,000 strong army that would have absolutely.
It definitely wasn't that big, but
it probably wasn't that big. But at the same time, we are talking about a guy who ruled the largest state in Europe at the time.
It was
and the reserves of manpower that he probably could have called upon were probably very substantial. And it is the first time you ever really get a sense of Salah ad-Din really being afraid is when he found out that Frederick Barbarossa was on the way. That was where he kind of, in a panic, started reaching out to all his his subordinate beys and emirs to be like, hey, we all need to get on the same program right now, because if we don't, we're gonna get crushed. So
yeah, I was just gonna say, G.A. Loud estimates that his army was probably about 15,000. But what's interesting about that is that number you're throwing out there is exactly, those are the type of numbers that were being used, which kind of shows how, the size of medieval armies at the time. I mean, 15,000 was a very large army.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Like higher end, it was possibly 20,000, but that was a huge army for the period.
Yeah. So, well, and not just a huge army, but a gigantic logistical undertaking.
Oh yeah. I mean, and it was very effectively done. That's one thing.
Right.
Barbarossa's army was, well provisioned and had meticulous discipline all through their progress, which is why they defeated the Seljuk Turks in 2 major battles, which is often forgotten about, but shouldn't be. It was there's a lot of people know the Battle of Iconium, but then there was also a major battle, the Battle of Philomelion, which was also a major German victory over the Seljuk Turks.
So. Well, and don't forget, he basically rode right into Constantinople.
I mean, he could have taken Constantinople if he wanted.
and didn't sack Constantinople. He didn't. He didn't. But it was let's just say it was very aggressive negotiations.
He basically dictated terms. Yeah, he basically dictated terms to the emperor, and the emperor.
He reminded them who actually was an emperor.
Right. And interesting comment here from 1.4 gigahertz. The German word Reise, meaning trip, vacation, originates with the annual Lithuanian Northern Crusades.
Yep.
That's pretty cool. I didn't know that. But yeah, and it is true that there were these kind of perpetual crusades that the Teutonic Knights would lead every single year.
Yep.
So pretty cool. How has the modern benign use of that word influenced our perceptions of the Crusades? I can't answer, because now that you're mentioning that that's the word for trip, I mean, the last time I think I thought about that was when I was in college taking German. So I remember that now that you bring that up.
And unfortunately, I'm not German. I don't think I could speak to that particular cultural vignette. But no, the history of the Northern Crusades are actually very, very fascinating, especially because the body that drove so much of them, the Teutonic Order, ended up becoming a state in its own right up there. The Teutonic state there in the Baltic, and they left such a remnant behind. They left such an impact behind. To where even clear up into the 20th century, there were cultural illusions being, that they were inspiring in various ways, both negative and positive. No, actually, what's very interesting is that you're right. Not only did they have those annual Crusades, they almost turned it into like a tourist industry, where various lords from Northern Europe, clear into the early 15th century, were they would pay a fee, and they would bring along their own little retinues and their own little armies, and they would go on these campaigns with the Teutonic Knights, and these campaigns were planned out long beforehand, and it was a way for them to crusade without having to go all the way to the east, which by that point was unfortunately pretty inaccessible at that time. So to include Henry Bolingbroke, future Henry IV of England, Henry V's father, was one of those who went on one of those rieses in Lithuania and brought his little retinue of both English knights and English longbowmen with him. And that's actually in the Prussian chronicles of the time. They talk about the strength and the power of the English bows and the skill of the English archers that he brought over with him.
Yeah, I got to pick up a copy of the Prussian Chronicle from Ashgate. I think that finally came out on paperback recently. I was thinking about getting that because it used to be really expensive on the hardcover option. But anyway.
Yeah, last I looked, it was like the hardcover was like well
absurd.
It was like well over $200 or something like that. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay, so Jonah says, to what extent was the Levant still Christian around the time of the First Crusade? Antioch and Edessa were both Christian cities. Jerusalem, too, had a minor Christian population. How about Tyre?
I would say the Levant was very Christian at the time of the First Crusade. In fact, a lot more Christian than I think modern historians give it credit for, or at least older modern historians give it credit for. Newer ones have started to challenge that model.
Yeah, there's been kind of a revision of the view on that recently. Historians are pointing out that the evidence shows that in fact the Levant was very Christian. Even some of the areas around Jerusalem, there were a lot of Christians there. But definitely Antioch and Edessa were entirely Christian.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it's actually, I think it actually says a lot to the success of the First Crusade that they had was because
it was essential.
So much of the native population was not only in line with them, but they were welcoming of them. There's that beautiful story. It actually does come from the chronicles of the time, but there's that beautiful story of when Tancred and Baldwin ride into Bethlehem.
Yeah, and that was
before they actually took Jerusalem. They rode east and south, and they went and took Bethlehem because the Fatimid garrison had been pulled out, and they'd essentially abandoned Bethlehem and a lot of the outlying cities in order to reinforce Jerusalem itself. And essentially they rode into Bethlehem unopposed. And not only were they unopposed, but they were openly welcomed by the native Christian population who had been living there and who had been preserving the site of the Nativity. And they lead them and their knights to where the site of the Nativity is, and it's this beautiful story, kind of this, one of those little, those beautiful little vignettes of what it must have been like to for these people who had been under the yoke of essentially what to them would have been an oppressive regime. An oppressive religious regime to where they, basically had to, hide the very thing that made Bethlehem so special, and then finally there's these Franks from the West, who come and they bear crosses and they recognize each other as Christians, at the end of the day, and they're there. One of the other things I think that modern, at least an older generation of modern historians get so wrong about the Crusading era is this idea that the Latin Crusaders saw no difference between Muslims and Eastern Christians. Like that is such a it's not even supported by the chronicle, by the writings from the time. Like it's not and by the actions of the ones from the time. I mean, you look at what Baldwin did in Armenia, with the Christian Armenians. I mean, he was very much welcomed by them, and he very much reciprocated it. And ended up marrying one of them. Ended up marrying an Armenian princess, who became his queen. This notion of, they were just a bunch of ignorant, blood crazed fanatics is just it's a concept that is thankfully dying the death it deserved to have a long time ago. And because that wasn't the case at all.
And Mailer Tarshall asks, Ave Maria, how old was the average crusader? What kind of man? Family men, mostly single men? I would say all of the above, to be honest. I mean, I think in any average crusader army, you would have found a lot of all of that you just mentioned. And one reason for that was that households went on crusade. And when we say household, we mean like a medieval household, which was a nobleman and his, many of his relatives, but also followers, men in his entourage who were, some would have been young men in training. Some would have been older men who were maybe, semi-retired. So, all of the above. Definitely the idea that your average crusader was just like a unmarried man trying to get land and titles somewhere is definitely not true. There were men like that, but there were all of the above.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, even many of the men that fought in the First Crusade, many of the nobles, the great men, the barons, they brought their families with them.
Yeah, there were a lot of women who traveled with their husbands.
Yeah.
And they didn't fight, of course. They weren't fighters. But
right.
There was a civilian element to a lot of expeditions. And they would have been protected and, kept in places where they would have been protected. But, part of it was they were going on pilgrimage, I mean, and women wanted to go on pilgrimage too. So
it was Raymond de Toulouse,
right, Elvira,
noted for having brought his wife with him, on the First Crusade.
Elvira, the daughter of Alfonso VI, who we were just talking about, kind of interesting. And he was one of those French knights, many French knights, especially at that time. Really, you see a ton of that from the late 11th century into the mid 12th century. There are a lot of French warriors going down to Spain and marrying Spanish women and joining in the Crusades and taking crusader vows down there. So, especially
from those southern French regions where France and Spain sort of blur into each other.
For a long time, the south of France had closer relations with Aragon and Barcelona than they did, Paris for sure. So. And then Tanner says there's a Japanese manga on Hawkwood. I didn't know that. That's kind of interesting.
I think I've vaguely heard of that. I don't think I've ever seen anything of it, but yeah, I think I have heard of that.
And then before we keep going, I'm just going to give a quick shout out again, guys. If you haven't watched it yet, please go to knightsofthecross.com to watch episode 1 of our TV show about the Crusades, historical drama that I helped out with the Christian channel, and consider pitching in and helping out make episode 2. So I'll just throw that out there and leave that on the screen for a while. And Marcus Toledo, for the Eastern Crusade to succeed, the Sultanate of Rome had to be attacked and destroyed first. That's an interesting point. And I'm not sure it's entirely true, though. I mean, hindsight is 20/20, and there are a lot of things that could have, for example, if Guy of Lusignan had just made a better choice before Hattin, I mean, that could have changed everything. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a good point you're making. I mean, I think it's a fair point, but it's again, there's just so much. I don't think there's any absolutes when it comes to what could have happened in the Holy Land long term.
I would have to agree, because it's not. I mean, there's so many places where things could have gone differently. Had Richard stayed just a little bit longer, had he, had Frederick Barbarossa not drowned in the Salef. Gosh, I mean, there's just countless examples of where things could have been different, but the only reason we can recognize those is with the 2020 vision of hindsight. And in the moment, I think it was ultimately an effort of a bunch of men who did, in their own ways, however flawed it was, they did the best they could with what they had at the time.
And let's see, Tom wants to know what was the largest battle of the Northern Crusades. And I'm going to point out that there actually weren't a lot of major battles just because of the nature of the warfare. There was a lot more. There were some, especially later on. I mean, everybody thinks of the Battle of Tannenberg, but that's kind of like that's kind of after the Northern Crusades.
That's the very end. Yeah, it's like it's almost the epilogue of the Northern Crusades.
There's a lot more a lot more hit and run type.
It was very low intensity. Very very low intensity, almost sort of like counterinsurgency kind of warfare that was going on up there. It was very very much the Baltics of the 13th century. It was kind of the Vietnam, or like the Afghanistan, of that part of the world. It was it was very low intensity, guerrilla type warfare that was, it was tit for tat, hit and run, take a village here, lose a village there, kind of thing. It wasn't on the same scale as we think of, the Levantine Crusades, which even their warfare for the most part would be very low level compared to what we think of today in terms of modern concepts of warfare. The idea of like these grand set piece battles, that was not the norm for medieval warfare. In fact, that was very much the exception, because grand set piece battles, while they got a lot of attention, one of the reasons they got a lot of attention is because it was extremely rare, because it was extremely risky, because there were just so many variables that you couldn't control despite your best efforts. And most medieval rulers of the time recognized that. So, we got away from that, once the early modern period hit and we started getting into more professionalized, the more professionalized warfare of nation states and things like that, that these grand, these massive gargantuan grand set piece battles start becoming the norm. And in a lot of ways, it tainted our thinking, especially when it comes to military history. But for the most part, grand, gigantic set piece battles were not the norm back then. They were the exception. Mm-hmm. So it's always something to keep in mind when you get into medieval military history.
And Tanner says Alfonso X had Granada on its knees before, and a lot of his army and himself died via plague. And I think
possibly one of the most high-profile victims of the Black Death.
Yeah. Oh, he died of Black Death. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then let's see. Tom asks if I'm going to write a novel about the First Crusade in the near future. And
I already have.
Well, I did something about Baldwin II a little bit later, but
okay. Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right.
I'm finishing up a book about the third. I mean, it's actually finished. I'm just kind of like nitpicking it right now about the Third Crusade, and that's going to come out this year. And I gotta say, Tom, I'm going to take a break from before I embark on another fiction project after that, because it's like
writing is
God,
exhausting.
it's
Like
a
it
lot of
really
work
is. Yeah,
to get it the way you want it.
Exactly. And as somebody who has, you know, dipped some of his toes into that pond as well, and had to pull back just because of life demands.
Yeah.
It's exhausting. Like it's exhausting. It takes a lot out of you. It chews up so much of your time, especially when you like get in the zone and you start writing, and it's all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, I just like lost an entire day. You know? So yeah, it's one of those things that, you know, hopefully I can get to. Hopefully we can all get to a point in life where you know, we have the kind of time where we can sit around like Bilbo Baggins, you know, in his hobbit hole and sit there and write there and back again, you know, um, and whatnot. But yeah, until we get to that point, that's it's rough. It's
Yeah.
rough.
What I've kind of been doing for the past 3 years on this book is um, getting up in the morning and working on it for, you know, an hour, a couple hours. And I haven't done that entirely consistently. There have been periods when I haven't been doing that, but I have been doing it, and you know, it is done. I mean, I am glad I've pretty much got it done. I'm just kind of, like I said, I'm kind of sort of polishing it up right now. But yeah, I kind of decided after that experience, I was like, okay, I'm gonna put this out, and then I'm gonna probably give it some time before I really.
Well, you're in a better place than I was than I am right now, because I had two writing projects that were kind of running concurrently, and both of them I hit a point where I started rethinking. Like I started completely rethinking both of them. And so now, so now I'm kind of like in this. It's not so much writer's block; it's more like writer's existential crisis, you know, where I'm like,
yeah, I mean that's kind of how it works.
yeah, and now it's like, hold on, like, oh my god, am I gonna have to like redo these entire things because I'm like now I'm sitting here like rethinking, like completely rethinking both of them. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm at the point now where I wouldn't mind, at least with one of my projects, I wouldn't mind going into a more kind of serial format where they're more like short stories that could eventually I could eventually partner with somebody who
or do a collection of short stories, you know.
Well, and actually I'm kind of thinking short stories that I could eventually partner with somebody to turn them into more kind of like a graphic novel format, which is I think they would go. I think it would fit much better the with that kind of story. But that's a whole different topic. But yeah, so it's right now I'm in the midst of just like some major you know, life movements, and it's kind of like that on top of literally rethinking something that I've, you know, been toying around with for the past 5 years of my life. It's, you know, now it's like, you know what, let me get to a point where I can actually sit and think about it. And then we'll see what happens.
All right. And with that, guys, I think we're going to have to call it a night. We're getting close to an hour and a half, but you know, this has been a lot of fun. It's always good to get Rand on here and spend some time talking about medieval history and talking about the Crusades. So I know we didn't get to all the questions, but you know, save your questions and we'll do some more next time.
Absolutely.
So Rand, a big thanks to you. Appreciate you coming on, brother.
It's always a pleasure. Absolutely, always a pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out with us a bit this evening. You know, glad to have everybody here. Thanks for the wonderful questions. Appreciate you guys. And check out knightsofthecross.com. Check out episode 1, and we'll talk to you guys next time. Okay.
Yeah.